So it's recording. And now I'm going to do a screen share. Actually, how do I do that? Here, share screen. And the thing I'm going to share is this slideshow. Sharing the screen. Okay, so you guys can see that, right? Ed, can you see that? It takes a couple of seconds to get to you. I know that.
Yeah, now we got it. Yes, yes. Can you see it, Joan? Mm-hmm. Okay, Joan can see it.
Well, everybody can see
it. Yeah, everybody can see it.
All right, great. So let's begin with this brief history of Messianic Judaism. All right? And as soon as I can figure out how to make the slide. Okay. Here we go. Okay, so we are going to start our story of Messianic Judaism back with Yeshua and his earliest followers. So everyone should know that the early Jesus movement, Yeshua movement, was a Jewish movement. It was a movement of Jews, by Jews, for Jews. And all of the earliest believers in Messiah Yeshua were Jewish and at home in Jerusalem, in the heart of the city, in the heart of Jewish life. There was no separation between being a Jew who believed in Yeshua particularly and a Jew who didn't. You were just, you just had different sets of beliefs. There were many different kinds of Jews. Judaism was a multifaceted religion in the early part of in what we call the Second Temple period. There were Pharisees, as you know, and Sadducees, and Essenes, and Herodians, and all kinds of groups, smaller groups that you never hear about because they're not recorded in the New Testament scriptures or anywhere else. And there were lots of these groups. And they all had, different beliefs, somewhat different beliefs about many things, but they also had a common core set of beliefs about what it meant to be a Jew. I mean, things like Torah observance, at least in terms of Shabbat, circumcision, the food laws, the holy days. They would have all agreed on all of those things, and then they would have divisions based on, particular observance and this, that, and maybe political persuasion or whatever it might be. So Messianic Judaism fit into that core. And here I'm going to show you in this next slide, if I can get that. In this next slide, you can see I drew up this thing for a class I was doing. Oops. Which was to try to give a brief description. Unfortunately, I can't get rid of this thing up on top. Oh, it goes away. There. Okay, so it says a picture of the Jewish world of the first century from a social perspective. So what I did was I broke the Jewish community in those colored boxes over there into 5 primary groups. Like I said, there were probably others. But these are the 5 primary groups. You had Pharisees, you had Sadducees, Nazarenes, Zealots, and Essenes. Now we would be classified among the Nazarenes, right? And if you'll notice, there are 2 yellow boxes on either side, which indicate what we would call levels of purity on the left-hand side. These levels of purity, meaning that the priests had to have the highest levels of purity, then Levites, Israelites, and so on. If you were to take a look at that list, for instance, tell me who's not included in the list on the left. You have priests, Levites, Israelites, proselytes, freedmen, illegitimate children of priests, temple slaves, and mamzers. That's what a bastard is, Mamzer. Mamzer is a Hebrew word that means you're of questionable birth. Okay? Who's not on that list?
Messianic?
Messianic.
No. Gentiles. Gentiles do not even get on the list. Why? Because they are tameh. And they're, at least in the land, considered, we don't count that.
Mm.
Okay, and you'll see on the other box this increased Jewish observance, which is this notion that what you had as you went up this this ladder of people, they would have an increased, theoretically an increased observance level as far as Torah was concerned. Now here's the thing, that within the Roman world, there were non-Jewish people who, for one reason or another, attached themselves to the Jewish people in various ways. They were called God-fearers, maybe. Some of them went as far as to become proselytes, which would actually put them on the list. But, for instance, Cornelius was a God-fearer. He was a man who was a Roman by birth, but who, in one way or another, worshipped the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And through that reason, he had an association with the Jewish people. We hear of stories in the Gospels of a Gentile man, a Roman probably, of some sort, who had a problem with, I think, his daughter, and people pleaded with Messiah to go heal her. Why? Because he had helped them build the synagogue. So this was another person who was kind to the Jewish people and maybe had some kind of an affiliation with them. So there were non-Jewish people who did affiliate. Okay? And so this, by the way, the Sadducees, Zealots, and Essenes were exclusivist groups and would not have included any non-Jews in them. But the Pharisees had some followers among the non-Jews. There are certainly stories from that time about people who wanted to go to the Pharisees and convert. A story about Hillel and Shammai and a convert and so on. And the Nazarenes, of course, later on fully embraced the nations. That became part of the mission of the Nazarenes or the Messianic Jews, right? Okay. Next slide. In this next slide, we see what happened. So here's what happened, right? It started out as a Jewish group, almost exclusive, in fact, exclusively Jewish people, because by the time we encountered Cornelius in the book of Acts, chapter 10, many years, a number of years had passed since the Messiah's resurrection. And so the ministry was out and among the Jewish people, primarily. Then we encounter a Gentile, Cornelius, who becomes a believer in every sense of the word. Peter preaches to him, the Holy Spirit falls on the man, the whole schmear. And in fact, we hear of a dispute that arises in Peter's collection of the story with the disciples in Jerusalem. In fact, I didn't bring my Bible, so I'm going to need some.
What kind do you want?
I have New American Standard.
That's
Yes.
fine. All right. So if you were to look in chapter, I think it's 10 of the book of Acts. Let's see. No, it's not chapter. It's not 10. It's chapter 11. So it tells us that Peter went back to Jerusalem to report on what happened between him and this man Cornelius, right? Let's see what. Okay, chapter 11, verse 1. It says, the apostles and the brothers throughout Judea heard that the Gentiles also had received the word of God. So when Peter went up to Jerusalem, the circumcised believers criticized him. And they said, you went to the house of an uncircumcised man and you ate with them. What do you do? In other words, if I could elaborate on what that conversation was like, Peter, what are you doing? Are you out of your mind? What's going on with you? It wasn't simply, hey, that's interesting. No, they opposed the idea because it sounded crazy to them, not knowing, not fully understanding the will of God. So Peter says he began to explain everything that happened precisely as it happened. He goes back through the dream that he had in Joppa and how he was invited to Cornelius' house afterwards, right? So we don't have to go through that. So he says in verse 15, he says, as I began to speak, speaking to the household of Cornelius, the Holy Spirit came on them as he had come on us at the beginning. Then I remembered what the Lord had said. John baptized with water, but you'll be baptized with the Holy Spirit. So if God gave them the same gift as he gave us, who believed in the Lord Yeshua the Messiah, who was I to think that I could oppose God? When they heard this, they had no further objections. And they praised God, saying, so then, God has granted even the Gentiles repentance unto life. Okay? So that's the first time. And it was a surprise to the believers. Here's the thing. So thereafter, the word of God goes out to the nations. And it goes out and is received pretty fantastically, if you think about those early days of the movement. And Paul had a major, very successful ministry in reaching almost all of Asia Minor and into Europe. However, because we hear about those few who actually agreed with Peter, don't believe for a minute that everybody also agreed. There were many who had difficulties with this whole notion of Gentiles becoming believers without converting to Judaism. Because they believed that the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob was the God of the Jews. So how could a person become affiliated with that God if they didn't also affiliate directly with the people? Meaning conversion. Okay? So now this becomes a bigger and bigger issue as Paul has more and more success in the Gentile world. So much so that they have to have a meeting regarding it. The apostles have to have a meeting. So they gather in the city of Jerusalem, and we've all, hopefully all read this in Acts chapter 15, that they have a council. So the Council of Jerusalem determined the status of non-Jews in the Yeshua movement. Okay? And the council anticipated three groupings within this Yeshua movement. It says communities of Jews, like the community in Jerusalem, because they made a decision. Gentiles don't have to convert. There's no need for conversion. They just have to follow a few, rules like no meat sacrifice to idols and blood and fornication and things like that. And then they're cool, right? So they anticipated that there would be, and this is what we see in the Gospels. So communities of Jews like the community in Jerusalem, a mixed Jewish and Gentile community like the community in Rome, which had both Jews and non-Jews. Jews had started that group prior to Paul ever going there. In fact, Paul never did go to Rome for the congregation's sake. He got arrested and went to Rome. Right? So there was a mixed community in Rome, which ultimately became almost all non-Jewish. And then finally, communities of Gentiles like the community in Ephesus. So when we read the letter to the Ephesians or the Laodiceans, we see a community that Paul addresses primarily as Jewish, as non-Jewish, excuse me. And when he's talking to these communities, or like the Galatian community, when he's talking to these communities, he's communicating to them as Gentiles, not as Jewish people. So thus the problem with the message that we often read, the seemingly mixed message that Paul sometimes seems to present. He's not presenting, it's just who he's presenting it to. And one has to be very careful about who he's presenting his messages to. All right? Okay. So you get this idea of communities like the community in Jerusalem of Jews, mixed communities like the Roman community, and communities of Gentiles. You know, it's much like the body of Messiah today. There are communities of Jews who, a small community sometimes in the U.S., and certainly in Israel, we have almost all Jewish people involved. And then you have mixed communities like this one. And then you have communities of all Gentiles. They're just called churches. Right? Okay. If anybody has a question, you can pop in and ask if you have something specific. We'll try and address it. Okay, so what happened? Remember, this is a history of the Messianic Jewish movement. So if we had stayed like we were in the first century, there'd be millions of Jewish believers in the world, presumably, and millions of Messianic Jewish believers in the world. But there aren't. Something happened. So we want to learn as much as we can in this short presentation what exactly happened. So let's see if we can dive into this. The roots of division. We had a radical Messiah, the ingathering of the Gentiles, the fall of Jerusalem, the church's evaluation, institutionalization, and the church triumphant. And we're going to go through each one of these. This is the pattern that I saw in my reading of history. Okay? First, a radical Messiah. Now, this quote that is up on the board is from a man named Jacob Neusner. Jacob Neusner is a famous Jewish scholar. He's not a believer, but he's a famous Jewish scholar, especially of the Second Temple period, and has written extensively about the Second Temple period and Jesus and so on. I think this quote is from A Rabbi Speaks to Jesus or something like that. I think that was the title of the book. Okay, so he says, in this particular quote, he's making up a conversation between a believer in Messiah and a Jewish person who does not believe in the Messiah. And he's drawing a conclusion about what is being asked of him. So he says, "And is your master God? For now I realize only God can demand of me what Jesus is asking. So, if with the disciple I cannot reply yes in following Jesus, I follow God. If I cannot do that, then I also cannot follow that master along the path that he, by his own words, set before me. In the end, the master, Jesus, makes a demand that only God makes." Now that's a true statement. So we have a radical Messiah. This is not some guy you can take or leave. It doesn't work like that. One has to have commitment, or one will not be a believer. So this, when confronted with this is a hard road to hoe for a lot of Jewish people. You're saying Yeshua makes demands that only God can make, and that happens to be true. So if one cannot accept that because of one's radical monotheism or whatever else is going on in their mind, then they're going to find acceptance of Messiah Yeshua very difficult. Okay? Secondly, there was the ingathering of the Gentiles. Now, I already told you that there was controversy in the early church about the inclusion of Gentiles as Gentiles. Now, that's a subject that I could spend 12 hours on, literally. I'd have you falling out of the window because I'm boring you, like Paul, about the complexity of the issues. I'm reading a book right now that's numb your brain on this subject of the relationship between Jews and Gentiles in the first century. Complex nature, particularly of Jews in the diaspora. Okay, so here's a Jewish response to all these Gentiles being included in what was ostensibly a Jewish movement. This is religiously, it appeared to weaken Torah by allowing Gentiles into the faith community without requiring conversion and adherence to Torah. And hence it appeared to dishonor God. What do you think about that? It appeared to weaken Torah by allowing Gentiles into the faith community without requiring conversion and adherence to Torah.
Well, that'd be true if it were men who allowed them in, but if it was God who allowed them in, he couldn't dishonor himself.
Yeah, but you see, that's easy. It's something God allowed. Oh, did he send you a telegram? Did he send you a text message? How did he tell you that? You know what I'm saying? It's an easy way to say, God. How many of you ever experienced this? You're talking to somebody about some subject, you're having a controversy about it, and the person says, well, God spoke to me. That is a statement meant to end the conversation. Right? How do you, God spoke to you, but he didn't tell me. How come? You know what I mean? That's why I don't really like to have conversations like that with anybody. Because after all, maybe God did speak to you, but he sure as heck didn't, inform me about the conversation.
Well, if we go on the other fork of the dilemma, then how do you honor God without requiring conversion and adherence to Torah?
Well, it was, so I'm just telling you what were the roots of division. This was one of those dividing points.
Oh, I see.
You'll recall there were Judaizers, quote unquote, these people who went around all over in the early days. In fact, the letter to the Galatians was written in order to combat that, right? Some people came in after Paul had been there and was convincing these people that they had to convert to Judaism and follow the mitzvot. And Paul argued against it in the letter, and so on. There was a great controversy regarding it. I'm saying that was one of the elements which caused the division between the Jewish people and their Messiah, ultimately. Okay?
Did they perceive that they had the power to stop it from happening? Or because they use the word allow, which means permission. So what could they have done to stop the outpouring of the grace of God on all flesh, as it was prophesied it would happen, that he would pour his spirit out on all flesh? So what could they possibly do to stop it? They couldn't stop it anyway.
Oh, no, they couldn't stop it.
Right.
The problem wasn't that they were being given the gift of the Spirit. That was evident. That would be sometimes physically evident.
Right, signs.
The problem was what was supposed to happen with them thereafter. And that was a controversy. Should they obey Torah, or did they not have to do it? That was a controversy among the early believers, and remained a controversy, I'm sure, into the second century. And there were parties. That you had the party of the circumcision and the party of those like Paul, who didn't. So factions had already developed in the early believing community on over Torah observance, and how far Gentiles had to go as far as that was concerned. It served to weaken the argument that this was a Jewish movement to Jews who you're trying to convince, hey, this is a Jewish thing. But then the Jew says, well, what are all these Gentiles here for? You know what I mean? So
The key issue is responsibility. The Jewish people have the responsibility to keep the Torah, and then what's being said is that there's no responsibility on the part of the Gentiles.
no responsibility to 613 mitzvot, yes, but certainly to the principles, if not the precepts. The principles were there in the teachings of the apostles. The very same things that we're told in the Torah to obey, as far as our behavior toward one another, particularly. I mean, the ritual stuff, no, but certainly thou shalt not kill and all those other things, murder or rob or whatever, or speak, evil, all that stuff are teachings of the apostles and could easily be, laid out in legal form if you wanted to. Okay, but they were not responsible to Torah and the 613 commandments per se. All right, but it appeared to many Jews that to be dishonoring to God, and it was one of those elements in this, disappearance of the Messianic community. Okay, second.
How did it dishonor God? Because he still had that covenant with the Jewish people.
Well, if you're saying that these people are now part of the people of God, but they don't have to do this, that, and the other thing, that tends to impress people that's dishonoring. I'm just saying it happened. It actually did happen, and that was the controversy that was raging in the early beginning.
Because the Messianic movement back then was part of the Jewish community, like it should be.
Right.
And so, because of that reason, some of the Jewish people themselves thought that Gentiles were.
I'll give you an example from the letter to the Galatians. Paul talks about this incident in which they're all having table fellowship, right? Remember?
Yeah.
There's this big table fellowship. And then some men from James, it says some men from James came to see what was going on in Antioch. And at that moment, Peter, Barnabas, and the other Jewish brothers separated themselves from their Gentile brethren. Because according to the guys from James, Peter, these men were not properly Torah observant and clean as they should have been, failing to realize the truth of the gospel, as Paul understood. By becoming faithful in Messiah Yeshua, they were cleansed and they were fine just the way they were. Okay, so that controversy already existed. Paul had to go through he had to shame Peter in front of all of the people and have a big, hullabaloo, and it was a big deal. So the controversy we know already existed. We see the controversy in its reverse form in the letter to the Romans, because there the Gentiles are dominating the congregation and putting pressure on the Jews about what they should do. Oh, we are observing days and weeks and this and that. And there's a big controversy over that. So the controversy already existed we're talking about in the 50s of the first century. I mean, Yeshua hadn't been gone for more than 20, 30 years, and they're already fighting. So, it raged. And that's bound to cause separation when you have that kind of argument that doesn't get resolved. Okay. Secondly, there was so we have the religious issue. And secondly, politically, it weakened the Jewish position of privilege with Rome by diluting their demographics. If so many people were allowed to somehow attach themselves to the God of Israel, they feared it might devalue membership of the people. Now, here's what that meant. Julius Caesar, because they supported him in his war against Pompey when he was trying to take over Rome, gave special dispensation to the Jewish people. They could practice their religion and did not have to involve themselves in the cults of Rome. That was special dispensation, because every other conquered people had to abide by the Roman cult. Okay? So now if you're Jewish, you're exempt from that. You don't have to pay the tributes or any of that other stuff, blah, blah, blah. Now, as long as they're born Jews, who cares? They're born Jews. We gave them their special dispensation. They're crazy, they're Meshuggah anyway. Who cares? Let them be. But now all of a sudden you have all these Gentiles from all these different provinces of Rome, and they're saying, well, we worship the Jewish God, we don't have to do the... Oh, no. That's not the way it works in Rome. You have to honor Caesar. You have to bow to the gods of Rome. You have to blah, 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 pay the tributes. And you see how it gets to be a political matter.
Mm-hmm.
And that threatened the Jewish status. You understand? Because now we're almost saying, well, the heck with it, we're taking away the privilege the Jews have themselves. And that would cause all kinds of problems because the Jewish people were ready to commit national suicide rather than worship the God.
Can't blame them.
Major problem, and a further cause of weakening this, why Jews were attaching themselves to the Messianic community, which embraced non-Jews. Okay, which was embracing non-Jews, this belief in Yeshua embraced non-Jewish people. So you can see how it gets complicated. These are very complicated issues, and I'm putting it in one paragraph when people have written whole books about that one paragraph. Okay. All right. Now, let's see what the church's response in the ingathering of the Gentiles. So the increasingly Gentile church saw the majority of Jewish people as rejecting Yeshua, and thus came to lump all Jews together as personally rejected. So they started putting, putting all the Jews in one basket as rejecting Yeshua. Now, where we are now, we're into the second century. I'm going to show you a quote from somebody. Some of you are going to get really shocked by it when you read it. I mean, but the attitude started developing. As more non-Jews got into it, they started taking it over, and their attitudes began to prevail. Okay, so this led before long to seeing Jews and Judaism as inherently anti-Messiah. Fear and blame toward the Jewish people soon infected the church and replaced the biblical call to intercede and testify to Israel and their Messiah. So, yeah.
What happened to Judaism in 70 AD, what I would consider Mosaic Judaism? What happened to the faith itself after 70 AD?
After 70 AD. It's a good question. So here's what happened. There's a legend. Sometimes these things are, smoky, a little unclarity, but a man named Yochanan ben Zakkai is the legendary proto-rabbi, if you will. He was smuggled, according to the story, he was smuggled out of Jerusalem during the siege of Jerusalem by Titus, the general who conquered Jerusalem in 70 AD. He was smuggled out. He had a conference with Titus in which he agreed to be allowed to go to a place called Yavne with his disciples, where they would peaceably study the Torah. He was allowed to do so. Thereafter, the city of Jerusalem was burnt to the ground. The leaders of the rebellion were the Zealots, not these Pharisees, or ordinary Pharisees like And of course, we all know the story. The city was burnt to the ground. The temple was burnt to the ground. 1 million Jewish people were killed. And the Masada incident, and they went down to Masada and killed the last men. They all killed themselves. That whole story. In the meantime, Yochanan and his disciples start a school, an academy in Yavne. And there in Yavne, they began to form the basis of rabbinical Judaism. They changed Judaism from the religion of the temple to a religion of prayer and mitzvot and good deeds. They created a whole new system which evolved over a long period of time. It didn't happen overnight, but over a longer period of time, it eventually evolved into what we know today as rabbinical.
Would you say that's a new religion or a new faith? It like Christianity, emerged out of the pool of first century Judaisms. There was a pool of first century Judaisms like the Sadducees, Pharisees, the Essenes, all these groups. Out of that primordial pool, two major religions emerged. Rabbinical Judaism on the one hand, Christianity on the other, with all of its facets. There's a 2,000-year history there. Okay. So here, the New Testament scriptures were uprooted from their Jewish context. In the hands of the church, the New Testament became a Gentile book that viewed the Jews as the religious other.
rather than as a Jewish book that reflected a deep disagreement among Jewish people about who the Messiah was. And thirdly, the Gentile majority, unaware of the nuances and subtleties of Jewish belief, tended to stereotype Jews. In short, the new Gentile majority became anti-Jewish. I'm going to demonstrate that to you with some quotations from the early church. Okay, this is not my opinion. This is exactly what happened. So now, what's happened by the 2nd century is there are many more non-Jews than Jews in the movement, and the Jewish people are being suppressed. They're being anathematized. They're being stereotyped. And you'll see in the quotes that I'm going to give to you now how they were forced to repudiate their Jewish lives. So we'll go to the next slide. So we just talked about the fall of Jerusalem. So Judaism at the beginning of the 1st century had a rich variety of religious approaches, which included Messianic Judaism. The revolts of 68 and 70 CE through 70 CE, and then again in 132 CE, ended in defeat for the Jewish people. When these revolts ended in defeat, Rome took Jerusalem away from the Jewish people. The Jewish people were no longer allowed to occupy Judea. Some fled to Galilee, which was a different province at the time. Many were dispersed throughout the empire. Many were enslaved and disappeared. Okay, you don't mess with the Romans. In the 1st century, Rome was at its height, and you did not mess with Rome in the 1st century. They were not averse to genocide, not at all. So as a legitimate way to deal with your problem. Okay, so after these revolts, Judaism became more strictly defined by a new orthodoxy. That's what I was telling you, right? Mm-hmm. The rabbinic Judaism that evolved from Pharisaism came to regulate and define what was Jewish and what was not. And because of their experiences, these traumatic experiences of messianism and revolt, they became in some ways anti-messianic. Because it was that messianic fervor that got the zealots all worked out. They didn't believe that Yeshua was the Messiah, but they thought that by making war on Rome, God would send the Messiah. And then in 132, they believed that this man Bar Kokhba was the Messiah. In fact, the most prominent rabbi of the time, Rabbi Akiva, his name is Bar Kokhba, son of the star. Okay, and he was a military leader, and he was declared the Messiah by Rabbi Akiva, one of the most prominent rabbis of all time, and certainly of that time.
But Yeshua did predict that this would happen in Matthew 24. He warned those that listened to him.
Yeah, there's that thing in Matthew 24, I guess it was, where he talked about Rome, Jerusalem being besieged and so on. Yeah. And many of the Messianic Jews actually fled the city during that time. An interesting factoid was Vespasian was the general who was assigned to conquer to suppress the rebellion in Jerusalem. He was on his way down through Galilee, on his way to Jerusalem, when he was called back, because I think, I'm trying to remember which emperor it was, but Galba, somebody like that, maybe it was Nero, I don't remember, was killed, and Vespasian was going to be declared the next emperor. So he had to go back to Rome. So everybody knew there was a lull in the war, in other words. And this is supposedly when the Messianic Jews fled the city of Jerusalem and its environment and went to Petra, over across the Jordan. And so that actually caused the division between the other Jews and these Messianics, because they didn't stay and fight. Kind of thing. And later on, in 132, when Bar Kokhba was declared the Messiah, all the Messianics who were fighting with the other Jewish people in the rebellion stepped away because Bar Kokhba was not the Messiah, and they weren't going to defend. That caused a further distancing of the Messianic Jewish community from the rest of it. So you have all these little nuances, all these things that are going on. You have to factor into why there's a separation. Okay? You have the Gentile problem, the Torah problem, the political problem, the Messianic problem. All of these things are factors in why the Messianic Jewish community faded from existence in the early centuries. Now, so let's move on. It says, so because of all of these elements, Messianic Judaism was defined out of Judaism. In other words, if you didn't follow the rabbinic tradition that was being developed, you were not Orthodox. It could not be included. So you weren't allowed in the synagogues. There would be issues in the synagogues. There would be issues in the society and so on.
Would they self-identify as Messianic? Would they have called themselves Messianic?
No, it would appear that they were part of what they call the Way.
Right.
Or
They didn't identify
or
themselves as
Nazarenes.
Messianic Jews.
No, because there were other Messianic communities. I mean, there weren't Jesus Messianic.
Right.
So they would have probably, the Way was one thing. Nazarenes were another. Those were some ways in which they distinguished themselves from others. Like the Essenes distinguished themselves.
Did they distinguish themselves amongst the group of Judaism?
Yeah, they would still be considered, before all this craziness, as part of the Messianic Jewish community. But they're being defined out over time, because now to be a Jew meant to be a Jew the rabbinical way. What the rabbis were saying is Jewish. Okay. Now, on the other hand, so that's the Jewish part of it. Now let's talk about what was going on in the early church. So the church saw the fall of Jerusalem as well-deserved judgment upon the Jewish people. In about 160 CE, I want you to understand, this is very early, 160 CE, this is the 2nd century. We're talking about 100 years after Messiah. Justin Martyr. Now, how many of you have ever heard this name, Justin Martyr?
No.
You guys are, you guys need to stop watching TV and or reading.
Sure.
Right? So Justin Martyr is one of the church fathers. He's one of the ante-Nicene fathers, upon which the foundation of the church, and I mean, when I say church, I mean the universal church, not Roman church. The universal church are built. Okay? So he wrote a book called Dialogue with Trypho, a Jew. He wrote a book, a treatise. And if you ever want to get sick to your stomach, just read it. Okay? So but here's just one little snippet from that. This is what he said. For the circumcision according to the flesh, which is from Abraham, was given for a sign that you may be separated from other nations and from us, the church, and that you alone may suffer that which you justly suffer, and that you may be desolate, and your cities burn with fire, and that strangers may eat your fruit in your presence, and not one of you may go up to Jerusalem. Accordingly, these things have happened to you, fairness and justice. Please. If I was Trypho, I'd have punched him in the mouth. I mean, but this is the attitude. This is the attitude of a church father. I mean, we're not talking about just anybody. We're talking about one of the, people who to this day is considered one of the great people of the early church. Okay, that's one problem. Secondly, institutionalization. Okay, in Judaism, after the fall of Jerusalem, Judaism became increasingly well-defined and rigid. We've already talked about that. This process culminated in the 5th and 6th centuries with the writing of the Talmud. There was still some latitude, but the Talmud became the basis for Jewish law and set the parameters of Judaism from there Okay? So that meant that in order to be a good Jew, you had to follow Talmudic understanding of Torah, which, ultimately got codified later on in things like the Shulchan Aruch. The Shulchan Aruch is a book for any household. Every Jewish household should have a copy of the Shulchan Aruch. And it tells you how to obey all 613 commandments to the letter. And I know about 6 Jews who know anything about it. But it is a book that you can read, because you can't read the Talmud. It's too hard. You have to have specialized training to be able to do it.
Didn't Maimonides write one too?
Maimonides wrote the Mishnah Torah, yes, in which 2 volumes of the Mishnah Torah, one with the positive commandments and the other one with the negative commandments, the do's and the don'ts. So he wrote the Mishnah Torah, yes. So that, those are a couple. And when we get to it, you'll get. I think I gave you a copy of the Standards of Observance.
Mhm.
This is our attempt at that
Same
kind
thing.
of thing, or we'll get to that as a way to practically observe the commandments.
If you have time, can I ask a couple perhaps esoteric questions?
Esoteric.
Yeah. On the one hand, you've got the Church who's ruled out the Gentile, or the Jewish people.
Yeah.
On the other hand, you've got the Messianic Jews who identify as Jews getting ruled out by the Orthodox Jews.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Do you suppose that through the last 2,000 years there's been some unknown, hidden remnant of Messianic Judaism through the ages?
We're going to talk about that if we ever get into the more modern period.
It couldn't have, I suppose it couldn't have disappeared altogether and then sprung up in the 60s.
We're going to talk about that.
Okay.
All right. You have a whole lot of slides to go through.
Okay. All right.
All right. I just want you to get this basic understanding, because people just don't. They don't understand what happened and why it had to happen. It happened like this. Okay. All right. So, in the church, here's what happened in the church. Now, remember, on the one hand, if you were a Jew, you were born a Jew. In order to be a Jew, you were much more rigidly and narrowly defined as to what you could believe and what you couldn't. So you're a Jew in the 3rd century, and you come to this understanding of what it means to be Jewish. Okay, very narrowly defined. It wasn't like in the 1st century where in Yeshua's time, where there were all these different kinds of Judaism out there. Now there was one narrowly defined religion. Okay, and what's going on in the church in the West at this time? Under Constantine, the church saw itself as the new Israel. And Constantine, the Christian emperor, ruling over a Christian empire as embodying the kingdom of God. So now Rome went from this pagan empire to the kingdom, becoming the kingdom of God under Constantine. And remember something, Constantine himself started out as a pagan. Okay? He didn't get baptized until he was on his deathbed. Okay, in this view, the kingdom of God was present as a triumphant church wed to a Christian empire. That's where it went wrong immediately. It went wrong right there when it wed itself to temporal power. This view soon eclipsed the prophetic hope that God would restore Israel and rule from Jerusalem for 1,000 years, like the prophets, every one of the prophets said. Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel, all of them prophesied of what was going to happen. And yet they decided that Constantine was the man. But the church did anyway. Who needs a restored Israel when the church triumphant has taken over Israel's identity? They don't need it. And you saw the attitude of one of the early church fathers that the Jews deserved whatever punishment that they had. There's something that developed, a doctrine which developed in Christianity, which I think in some places in Christianity may still exist, maybe not. We live in a more tolerant time, called punitive supersessionism. So economic supersessionism is the idea that the church has replaced Israel. That's called economic supersession. Punitive supersessionism is was developed because the church leaders had to explain why Jews still existed. If God had rejected them because of their rejection of the Messiah, why did they even exist? Oh, now I know. It's to eternally punish them so that they'll be an eternal example to the world of what happens when you mess with God. It keeps them alive to torture them. That's punitive supersession. It's a crazy idea that has no place in any understanding of God.
Oh.
Right?
Who thought this up?
Oh, I mean, you want me to go through the whole history? I'll give you, all of these guys. I mean, Irenaeus, this guy, Justin Martyr. I'll go through all the church fathers if you want. But they all adopted the idea and developed the idea. Okay? So now, where did that leave the remnant of Messianic Jewish believers? Somebody that you just mentioned. So what happened to them?
Yeah. What happened?
Okay. Now we're going to try and figure that out. Right? So on the one hand, the Jewish community is rejecting them. On the other hand, the Christian community is saying they can't even exist. What? What did happen? So let's see. From Judaism's point of view, we had to abandon the Messiah. So in the Talmud, it reads, on the eve of Passover, Yeshu, that's the way they refer to it. This Yeshu, which is supposed to be some kind of a,
Anagram.
curse. It's an anagram. Was hanged. For 40 days before the execution took place, a herald went forth and cried, he is going forth to be stoned because he has practiced sorcery and enticed Israel. This is the Jewish conclusion, right? That Yeshua was an idolater and a heretic who was leading the Jewish people away, and it says somewhere in Deuteronomy or something like that, if a man rises as a false prophet, don't listen to him and stone him.
Is this the remnant that we're talking about?
No,
or
this is the Orthodox.
No,
I thought you were answering the question of what happened to the early believers in
Right.
Yeshua.
Right.
Where are they? They're not these people.
No, they're not these people. No, this is the Judaism that was developing. We get it. All right. So then it says from Christianity. So from the other side, Christianity's point of view, we had to abandon the God of Israel and Torah. So on one hand, they want us to abandon the Messiah. On the other hand, they want us to abandon Torah. Because the church says, look, this is the Church of Constantinople, for example, required this statement of faith for a Jewish convert. So now, if you're a Jew and you have to convert to Christianity, as if that was even a possibility for you, to convert to worshiping their own God. Okay, you had to make this statement. I want you to look at this statement carefully. This is verbatim from the document. I renounce absolutely everything Jewish, every law, right, and custom. And above all, I renounce Antichrist, whom all the Jews await in the figure and form of Christ, and I join myself to the true Christ. So you have to make this statement.
It contradicts itself.
You have to renounce. In other words, you are no longer a Jew. You want to know what happened to the Messianic Jews, the Jewish believers of that time? This happened. This happened to them, or they returned to Judaism. All right. Now you know what happened to them?
I
They're gone.
imagine
In other words, for 1,500 years or more, we were compelled to do that. I should have put the date of that Council of Constantinople. It was probably 3rd or 4th century. All right?
So can I ask a hypothetical question?
Hypothetical?
Yeah, hypothetical question. Based on something that happened, I believe it was Elijah. I'm the only one left, and
Yeah.
Father says there's 7,000 that you don't know about.
Right.
Could it be that there's some sect that was so low on the radar that history hasn't recorded?
Okay, there's a book called The Nazarenes, a very obscure tome, which explores what happened to the Nazarene community up until and into around the 4th century, where they finally lost track. So these were people. Some people believe that the Christian sect of Ebionites were Jewish believers who wanted to retain some semblance of Torah still. This book, The Nazarenes, also traces this group of people who went into diaspora and managed to survive into the 4th century. But after that, there's no trace of them because the church became so overwhelmingly powerful in all of the known world. I mean, if you're talking about Europe, the Middle East, and Western Europe, I mean, it was just it had overwhelmed everything, either between the Orthodox Church or the Roman Church, and so you couldn't. I mean, eventually they absorbed everything, and because they were wed to temporal power, you couldn't exist. You had to exist underground. If you were going to be in rebellion. You know how many wars were fought between the early, Orthodox Christians and Roman Christians? I mean, what was the name of that group? I'm drawing a blank here at the moment. But literally wars, thousands upon thousands of people who believed that Jesus was the Messiah were killing each other. It's one of the reasons Constantine did what he did. He wanted to unite the empire under one thing.
Yeah, I read.
So he came up with the Orthodox Christian faith, what he called the Orthodox Christian faith.
All right. Well, my question.
And when the Roman Empire split between the Eastern Empire and the Western Empire, that's when the church split.
But there's always been a faithful remnant of Messiah, I believe. I mean, it's a theory.
Yeah,
It's a theory, but there's no historical evidence. There's no archaeological evidence that we lasted beyond the 4th century.
All right, so reasonably, history can't close out the possibility that some existence.
Well, you can never do that.
There you go. Thank you.
You can never do that. But on the other hand, there's just like no evidence. And what did happen was this statement. When a Jew determined to become a believer in Jesus, they renounced their Jewishness.
Yeah.
And so if I'm a Jew and I'm in the year 1000 and I decide to become a believer in Jesus, I renounce my Judaism, and certainly by the next generation of my family, they're not even going to think of themselves as Jews if they even are Jewish, other than through my DNA. So the Jewish people completely disappeared, and there were lots of times. I think we're going to skip some of that. During that period, this 2,000-year period, where Jews, wherever they were living, were forcibly converted. Like during the Inquisition, and at other times where there was forcible conversion, where you converted or you died. And this is where the whole converso thing comes from in Spain. All of these Spanish Jews were forcibly converted during the first between the years 1000 and 1400, when they were finally expelled, and a lot of those Jewish people, a lot of those Jews, would pass down little traditions in their family, even though they couldn't practice Judaism. So
Are you using Jewish or Jew? I know the history of the word itself, but are you using that synonymous with Israel?
Well, there was no Israel. Remember, right? There was no Israel after 132. After 132, when the Romans decided to throw the Jews completely out of Judea, they renamed the area Palestina.
Right.
So it's Palestine. It's been Palestine to this day, or at least according to some. Okay, And so the Jews were dispersed throughout the world. I mean, literally. I mean, there were only a remnant of Jewish people, small remnants who lived in the north in like Galilee area. And there was always some remnant, a few thousand, a few 100,000 maybe, not even that, who would live in the north. But as far as the southern end of the thing, it was all gone. And then, and then after that period of time, after the Romans left there, the Muslims came. I'm not going to go through the whole history of the Middle East, but you had the Muslim period, and then the Turks, and all that stuff.
When does Messianic Judaism resurface on the historic radar?
Okay. All right.
Before we go to that, the Jewish people were forced to do this. They never willingly.
Well, I mean, some probably willingly did. I'm sure you can find Jews who willingly decided I want out, and I want to become a Christian.
What about the people? When I think of Israel, I think of the people, and everyone that identifies themselves with Israel may not believe in Yeshua. So there still is a people of Israel.
Well, of course, there were always the Jewish people.
They're all over the world.
Oh, they're all over the world dispersed, right. And I will say this about the role of the rabbis. God used them, in my opinion, providentially, supernaturally, however you want to do it, hold the Jewish people together as a people. Because their definition of what the Torah observance of the Jews and being what it meant to be a Jew, they came up with that, and they did a good job holding the people together. Even though we were in all the world, it was still, in some sense, a nation. Part of that also has to do with the fact that the nations never accepted the Jews wherever they went. They were always a persecuted minority, largely because of Christian anti-Semitism. Because particularly in the Christian world, I can take you through the whole history. If you look at the Jewish people who went into the Sephardic world, what I call in Northern Africa,
it's true. They're still
went east into Babylon and further, those Jews never suffered the persecution that happened to Jews who went into Europe. The European Jews, those who went first to Spain and went into Italy, all those places. Wow, their life was miserable. We call the period like between, I want to say, 500 CE and 1200 until the start of the Inquisition in Spain. We call that the golden era of Judaism. It's called the golden era because Jewish people flourished during that time in Northern Africa and in Spain. Wherever the Moors went were okay with the Jews. They actually treated them reasonably well. Not like as if they were Muslims, but certainly better. But if you went into France, Italy, Britain, life for the Jewish people was a horror. And those were the Christian ones. So it was because of this punitive supersessionism that I talked about. And they were supposed to be a downtrodden people. It was our job to make sure that happened. Terrible. Well, we don't have time for all of that history. That's another whole thing. Okay. Reemergence of Messianic Judaism. What were the factors in its reemergence? So here they come. One, the age of pluralism, the move of God, the missions, pioneers, Six-Day War, Jesus movement, and finally the modern period. So in the next 20 minutes, I got to do it. All right? So we'll start with the age of pluralism. So now, we all know that today we live in a secular age. It's post-Christendom, in fact. And it's increasingly so since the Enlightenment of the 18th century. So everything starts in the Enlightenment. Now here's what, without going into all that the Enlightenment was, and if you want to know about that, read books. But here's the big idea that came out of the Enlightenment, in my mind. That individuals mattered. that individual people could have their own thoughts, and it created an ecumenicalism, a pluralism that did not exist up until that time. In other words, if you weren't part of the status quo and the church and the whole thing, you couldn't exist. But once you got into the Enlightenment, where they challenged all those ideas of authority and of origins and all the other things that came out of the Enlightenment, it was easier for you to be something other. It was easier for you to be other. This gave way to you have in modern America, you know, if you're not a tolerant person, you're not tolerated. You know what I mean? I mean, it's kind of weird, but that's true. If you're an intolerant person, nobody tolerates you. You know what I mean? You can't be like that. Anything goes. Anything. That's how far we've taken this idea of the importance of the individual.
Irving Berlin was Jewish.
Yeah, but you know, right. That's right. Anyway, so the point, you know, so that's the big point I want to take out of that whole idea of enlightenment, that we live in an age of pluralism, which made the idea of being a Jewish person easier, particularly in Christian Europe. Okay. So today's emphasis on the church as a body, an organism, a community has tremendous healing possibility. In other words, the church was this institution in the earlier days, before the Protestant Reformation. Afterwards, it became more of this body, and it was one of those things that allowed for inclusivism. This is my point. Now that idea will develop itself as we understand what happened to the church in the 19th century, as far as Jewish people were concerned. Okay. And today, Judaism in the post-institution era has also regained much of the diversity and openness of the first century. Today, Judaism, you know, even when I was a little kid, I mean, there were Reform Jews. The Reform movement started in the 19th century, Reform Judaism. But generally speaking, if you thought of Jewish, there was only, right? I mean, it's just Orthodox. I mean, you know, basically everybody's, whether you were practicing or not. You went to shul, the rabbi was Orthodox. You know what I mean? Everybody else, unless you were Reformed, and then you went to that nutty, you know, synagogue down the street.
What do you mean?
Okay. So, but today Judaism is much more diverse. I mean, today you have Orthodox, and you have modern Orthodox, you have Hasidic. You know, Orthodoxy has a whole stream, you know, group of different streams. You have conservative Judaism of all kinds.
Yes.
You have Reform. You have humanistic Judaism. You have Reconstructionist Jews. You have Jews of Hindu, you know, Jew-boos. You got the whole thing. Everything is it's all there.
Minus
So it's
special.
and that kind of openness, believe it or not, that's actually helpful to us, because even though we're still left, you know, kind of on the outside, all of a sudden, you know, there's a possibility, you know, because Jewish people don't think monolithically anymore. You know, it's possible. And maybe it's Jesus. And you've seen it in the reclamation of Jesus as a Jewish person by the Jewish community. He's mishpacha. He may not be the Messiah, but he's mishpacha. You know, he's family. So, you know, so we see him more openness. All of these will contribute to the ability for Messianic Jews to pop their head above the ground. Okay, I hope my argument makes some sense.
It makes sense.
Okay. Now, let's talk about God himself. It's God's, you know, God has his own timing. Right?
Amen.
So here, in the middle of the 19th century, this is where I identify. In the middle of the 19th century, there came a move of God stirring the hearts of Jews and non-Jews alike. It happened in both communities. And I'll give you some evidence. So for the non-Jews, it manifested itself as a desire to reach out to Jews more specifically with the message of the good news. In other words, missions to the Jews. Remember what I told you about the church's attitude toward Jews? The heck with them. I did not even discuss you with Martin Luther, who, at first he wanted to convert the Jews, but then he, at the end, when he found out they weren't coming to him in droves, he turned on them. And he wrote horrible things. He wrote a tract called The Jews and Their Lies, in which he calls for the destruction, the actual destruction of the people.
Wow.
Okay? So now that attitude, pervaded the church for centuries. But now in the 19th century, they're saying no. People are beginning. I don't know what it was. Maybe they started thinking more eschatologically and seeing, wow, wait a minute, the Jewish people are there at the end of days, and maybe if we could reach the Jewish people, we could bring the Messiah back. Things like that. Certainly, dispensationalism attributed to that, which was a kind of Christianity that saw that in the end of days, the Jewish people were going to be important again. So that might have contributed to that. So there was all of a sudden this desire to reach the Jews with good news. And for Jews, there was a newfound desire to respond positively to the message about Messiah. I'm going to show you that too. Okay? So now here's one. This is the early Jewish mission. The Christian Missions to the Jews was a British organization which started in the year 1809. I think 1809 or 1810. And specifically, they were people who wanted to reach the Jewish people with the gospel. Okay, that they should be saved. And that gave birth to the London Jews Society. So this is the London Jews Hospital, the society that they built in London. Society built this hospital, and here these were Jewish believers who were promoting the gospel among their own people. Right? So you see, it was founded in 1843. The society. So in the middle of the 19th century, Jewish people started to receive the good news and were at least maintaining some connection to their Jewish identity through these societies. Now, all of these guys were probably members of the Episcopal Church, the Church of England.
They weren't identifying themselves at that time as Jews, right? They were probably absorbed into the Christian community. They were.
I'll give you an example. Benjamin Disraeli. He was a Jew by birth, but his father was not a very religious Jew, and wound up having him baptized.
Oh.
Okay, and because they were much more assimilated into British culture, and eventually Benjamin Disraeli became prime minister of Great Britain. And a lot of Jewish people did that. I mean, Moses Mendelssohn was also he was a very secular Jew. He didn't become a Christian, but he was a very but his grandchildren became. Who's the musician? Mendelssohn, the musician. Felix was a Christian. So Jews were moving back and forth across the boundaries which once completely prohibited them from being a part of the society to being assimilated into it. And for some, they crossed over. There was a crossover. Here, these members of the London Jew Society, while they were Christian and went to Christian churches and so on and so forth, maintained, at least in some respect, a connection to their Jewish identity. Remember what you had to say any number of centuries ago to disavow all of that, or during the Inquisition, where if you even looked like you were looking Jewish, they would kill you. And anybody know what an auto de fe is? You know what that means in Spanish?
Yourself, right?
Auto de fe is an act of faith. You know what the act of faith was? Burning on a stake. So if you were a Jew, and you were caught, if you were a Jew who was forcibly converted, and you decided to secretly practice your Judaism, you know, what they call Moranos, which means pig. You know, these are guys who, you know, you're secretly practicing your Judaism. I have some crazy stories about that. You know, these people, if they were caught by the Inquisition, they would have to do an auto de fe, meaning they would probably burn it for their apostasy. Because after all, you're a Christian now. How could you do that? You are now, you know, so they burn you. So it's crazy. You know, now in the 19th century, now we're going up 400 years or so. Now these Jewish people can still make some connections to their Jewish roots. Okay, they're not Jews. They're not practicing Jews. They're probably, you know, part of the official Anglican Church, but nevertheless they are able to make a connection and reach out to their fellow Jews in these ways. Right? They build a hospital, right? Ani Adonai Refa'et, or whatever it means, which means the Lord, I am the Lord, your God, your healer. And the Lord, your healer. Right? For this one, Refa'eni Adonai Verapeh, which means heal me, O Lord, now. Right?
Mm.
So they were making that identification with the Jewish connection, right? Okay. So 3 men. So these are 3 rabbis, all who became believers in Messiah Yisrael. So Rabbi Joseph Rabinowitz up here had a congregation. He was the rabbi of a congregation, I believe in Russia. I'm pretty sure. I have his biography collection. And this depicts him going to Jerusalem. You see, this is Jerusalem in the background. And according to the story, he was on the Mount of Olives praying, and he received a vision of Messiah. And as a result of that, became a believer. But he did not become a Christian. What he did was he went home, back to his home congregation, and began to preach Yeshua there. And he had the first, what we would call, Messianic congregation. Now, it didn't last beyond him, from what I know. But he probably left a remnant of believers there. But he was when we go back over our history, Joseph Rabinowitz is this revered figure of the one who got the first Messianic congregation going since the apostles. Okay? Rabbi Isaac Lichtenstein, who was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, was also a believer in Yeshua, but in more, he maintained his Jewishness completely, but of course was involved in church. He was not able to do the Messianic synagogue thing, and he was a pioneer in at least getting the word to the Jewish people. The Jewish, another interesting life. You can get biographies of these guys. They're available through the Vine of David publishing, through the FFOZ website. If you go to First Fruits of Zion website, they have. Well, if you go to First Fruits of Zion, their website, you can get to their Vine of David's connection, which they print these, and they print these biographies. They have a biography of Rabinowitz, in fact. I don't see it here. I have it. Okay. And finally, Rabbi Leopold Kohl, who was a Polish rabbi who came to the United States in the late 19th century. and became a believer in Messiah Yeshua. And of course, again, it's a long story, but he, hello, and he began a ministry to the Jewish people called the American Board of Missions to the Jews, which today is known as Chosen People Ministry.
Oh,
Okay.
can you repeat the name?
American Board of Missions to the Jews. Became Chosen People Ministries, and actually Jews for Jesus emerged out of that. Okay, so these were all these missions to Jewish people. Now, of course, there was no Messianic Jewish community. There were Jewish believers in Jesus, and they funneled, when they became believers, they would be funneled into churches. You know, and there was a lot of controversy regarding the whole notion of a Messianic Jew. Next week, we're going to talk about it. I'm going to show you, I'll get you a copy of a magazine that was out at the time called The Messianic Jew. Very controversial to even talk about it in those terms. You know, Jewish Christian, Hebrew Christian, that was terminology that was acceptable, but Messianic Jew was a really, controversial matter.
Because you were still Jewish.
And because of your primary locus of identity.
Jewish, yeah.
And we're gonna, we'll get into that discussion more deeply next week when we talk about that magazine. And you'll be really shocked at some of the articles in the portion that I'll get to. It's amazing. So anyway, so these were some of the early pioneers of Messianic Judaism in its earliest form, in its more Hebrew Christian form. And essentially, other than Rabinowitz himself, these men were interested in evangelizing the Jewish people, but at least helping them to retain some measure of their Jewish identity, even though that's very difficult to do in a Christian setting. It just is, because the church is not equipped to help you do that. Okay. Then you had the convergence of historical events. We're getting close to home. So there were two major events, and there were others that there are a number of other things that occurred. But these are the two major things that I believe occurred in the 60s. You had the 6-Day War. Now, by the way, as an aside, I should say to you, I should tell you that all during the late 19th century into the early part of the 20th century, the Jewish people in diaspora, in general, were migrating back to the land. We have the Chalutzim movement. The Chalutzim is pioneers, in other words, the Hebrew word pioneer. Of people who were coming back into the land of Palestine. And Jews started to reoccupy the land. 100 here, 1,000 there, and so on. It started in the mid-19th century and gained momentum as the years went. And they were the ones who drained the swamps in the middle of the country and started to make the desert bloom and the whole shit. At one time, God is moving the Jewish people back into the land, and at the same time, they're starting to come. Some small remnant are coming back to faith in Messiah Yeshua at the same time. All this is happening, and then these two great events emerge at almost precisely the same moment. We have the 6-Day War, which gave us Jerusalem back as our city, as our capital city. Right? That's the big thing about the 6-Day War. That we got Jerusalem back after 2,000 years of occupation. And at the same moment, the Jesus movement hit in America. And in the Jesus movement, thousands of Jewish people became believers during the Jesus movement. Difference between this one and any other kind of revival is that those Jewish kids did not want to become Christians. They believed in Jesus, but they wanted to retain their identity as Jews. This was a move of God. And before, no, you don't believe it, go to church. And this time, there was enough critical mass to say, no, we're not going to do it. I should also tell you that if we go back a step to these guys and some of the work that they performed, there was another organization which I need to add a slide here. In the mid 18th century, around 1860 something or other, an organization formed called the Hebrew Christian Alliance. This was an alliance of Jewish believers in Jesus who wanted to retain some measure of connection. It was sort of like the London Jews Society, only American. That they wanted to be able to retain some connection to their Jewish roots, and primarily they existed to promote the gospel among Jewish people. So together with people like Leopold Cohen, and his organization, Jewish Mission was on the rise. Okay? So you have that Hebrew Christian Alliance. So let's go back to the next slide when all these things are happening. We had, so the Hebrew Christian Alliance developed into a major gathering place, and today it's called the Messianic Jewish Alliance of America. Okay?
Hey.
I'm going to just skip to the most salient points. In 1975, the Hebrew Christian Alliance, which had all of these young people coming into it from the Jesus movement, changed its name from the Hebrew Christian Alliance to the Messianic Jewish Alliance. That was a very significant move, as we'll get into much more deeply next time. Because now we did not want to be Christians of the Hebrew variety, we wanted to be Jews of the Messianic variety. That's a major step in another direction. Because now we started indigenous congregations of our own, rather than just go to the church and wind up being absorbed. Because I can tell you, still, most Jewish people who become believers go to church. And when they do, within one generation, their children do not even consider themselves Jews. Within one generation, their Jewish identity is lost again. Now there's a movement that says, no, our Jewish identity is important to God. He made us that way. And there's and we'll get into that as we go through this class, what was God up to and what is God up to in retaining that distinction between Jews and non-Jews. God is up to something. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
So you have the movement. So now, our last slide for today is a little overview of the Messianic Jewish community as it's currently structured. Now, this is my interpretation. Others will say it's incomplete. Others will say something else. But I'm going to break it down into three essential parts. One, the missions movement. Secondly, Messianic Jewish synagogues. And thirdly, the Messianic Jewish educational institutions that are developed. Okay? So let's start with missions. In the missions, the primary ones. These are the primary ones. There are many smaller Messianic Jewish or Jewish missions around the world. These are the three major ones here in the States, so I put them up there. You have Jews for Jesus. And let's start with Jews for Jesus. Here's my thing about Jesus. In my opinion, when people ask me what Jews for Jesus is, I tell them it's a Christian mission, which has a mission, a Christian missionary organization with a mission specifically to the Jewish people, to preach the gospel among the Jewish people. Now, I call it that because they do not necessarily promote that their people be Messianic Jews, other than they have to be Jewish. I believe all the
Wow.
workers are Jewish,
Yes.
but they don't have to be Messianic. Most of them don't go to Messianic synagogues or consider themselves part of that community. They consider them, they mostly go to church. Mostly. Now, there are a few who don't. I know some who don't. But many, many, many of them do, and it's not necessary. And I know Moshe Rosen, and I knew what his philosophy was. He basically didn't think the Messianic Jewish synagogue movement was a necessary thing. He felt that Jewish people were better served if they go to a good church.
So now
So-
you've got David Brickner,
Yeah.
okay, but he is still following pretty much the
Yeah.
same thing. He's a little bit more, I would say,
Open,
not.
right?
Yes, he's more
A little
open.
more open. Yeah. He's more open than
Than
Moshe
Moshe
would have
was.
been. But the philosophy remains more or less the same. Doesn't really matter. If that's your preference, then fine, but it's not really necessary.
But the difference is now there are more Messianic congregations now.
Well, there are more Messianic congregations. When Jews for Jesus first began, there were very few, and they weren't very stable groups. But Messianic Judaism has evolved since then. It's much different. Yeah, this congregation in 1986, you might have said, "Well, gee, why would I go there?"
Mhm.
But today it's a completely different story. I mean, so and the whole community is much more evolved
Yes,
than it was back in the early days, right?
yes.
Okay. So secondly, you have Chosen People Ministries, which we talked about really being the parent organization. I put Jews for Jesus on top because so many people know them.
Mhm.
They know them more than they know about Chosen People Ministries. So CPM is, again, another, it's largely Christian supported by other Christian groups, and does pretty much the same thing, although they, Mitch Glazer, who's the president of the organization, who was here for our high holidays, you probably didn't even notice, but he was here with his family, is more, he's flexible. He's a more flexible guy. He go. I don't know whether I don't think he goes to a Messianic congregation regularly. But they do have congregations. They have established congregations. This congregation was started by CPM, and then they left us independent. So they've established a number of congregations around the world, and so they're a little more open to the idea of the Messianic Judaism. And CPM is more integrated into the wider Messianic Jewish community, to my knowledge. Thirdly, you have Jewish Voice, which may be the biggest one of them all. Jewish Voice, however, uses multimedia. They're on television. They have a worldwide ministry. They do a lot of work in Africa, among the Beta Israel and places like that. They do a lot of really good work. I think it's a great organization. What they do, the leadership is top notch. And again, their goal is to reach the Jewish people with the good news. So that's their primary locus. Their primary focus is outreach. We'll just categorize it that way. Their primary work is outreach to the unsaved Jewish community. Okay? Then you have the synagogue, the Messianic Jewish synagogue movement. So you have the missions movement on the one hand, you have the synagogue movement on the other. The synagogue movement has the UMJC, the IMCS, all this alphabet soup. Let me just go through some of this quickly. The UMJC was the first congregational membership organization. In the early days, the Messianic Jewish Alliance was the one group where Messianic Jews congregated. And in the 70s, when they made that switch to Messianic Jewish Alliance, we wanted to form our own indigenous congregations. And a number of congregations began to spring up. So where prior to that, you might have had 4 or 5 or 6 quote-unquote congregations which were outreaches of Christian missions. So you had the Presbyterian church sponsoring a Messianic group within its church. Now you had indigenous Messianic congregation. And so a group within the MJA, young people who smart young people, guys like Dan Juster, John Fisher, Stuart Dowerman, others like that, they wanted to form a congregational organization, an organization which would pool the resources of the congregation in order to develop congregational life. That's what they wanted to do. So they broke away from the MJAA and formed the UMJ. We are members of the Union of Messianic Jewish Congregations. This congregation is a member, and the membership that we have had in the union has been invaluable to the development of this area. Invaluable to me personally and to the congregation as a whole. You may not even know why or how, but take it from me, we probably wouldn't be here if it wasn't for this organization. Certainly wouldn't be here before that. So my association, Nero's association, Jared's association now, with the other leaders in the movement, happens through that. We get a lot of resources from them. A lot of the material that we're looking at now is part of the pooled knowledge of. Okay. You have the IAMCS, which is now the congregational organization that's directly linked to the Messianic Jewish Alliance. In other words, Messianic Jewish Alliance, seeing that the union was doing what it was doing, decided it needed a group too for the congregations that affiliate more directly with it. There's a slight difference, a little differences that are being obliterated, actually, thank God, between union philosophy and the Messianic Jewish Alliance. The union is much more interested, I should say, the union focuses a lot more on education, on its leadership being educated, and and less. It's a less charismatic movement. The MJA is more charismatic in their expression, much more affiliated directly with the church, with the Christian church. There's slight differences, but those things are being obliterated by the second and third generation of church believers. They don't care about any of that believers. So they're, I think I see one day when these groups will merge. At some point, this alphabet soup is going to go away.
Mm-hmm.
This is what happens when you have a bunch of young people. We were young. Everybody's an A personality,
Mm-hmm.
and everybody thinks they're the smartest guy in the room. When you think that, and that's what it takes to get a movement started. Sorry, if you don't have a bunch of, really, like people totally convinced about themselves, they don't have the gumption to do what we did in the 70s and 80s. You just don't. I'm not bragging. I'm just saying. I'm stating facts, because we had nothing but opposition from everywhere we turned. You have to have a strong constitution to do that. But along with a strong constitution comes a gigantic ego. That's why you have so much alphabet.
That's how I see Paul.
Yeah.
Not our Paul.
Yeah.
Paul in the Bible.
Yeah. No, I know.
He was so sure of
He
his
was sure.
position.
He was sure of his call.
Mhm.
All of us are sure of our call, and we're convinced that we're the ones who are right. And that's why you have so many alphabets. But our kids are not that. They don't have the same fight. So I think all this is going to merge in the next 20, 30 years. Thank God.
Yes.
Okay. So we talked a little bit about the MJA. The MJRC, which I am the executive director of, is the Messianic Jewish Rabbinical Council, and we do halakhic work. What does it mean to live a Messianic Jewish life? And we work on talking about that and trying to come up with things that people can do on a practical level to live out a faithful Messianic Jewish life. That's our job. So when we go through the standards of observance, you'll see what some of the work is. Tikkun is another organization that's now centered in Israel, which is a revivalist group. And, this is Dan Jester's baby, and he's a man who's very interested in revival, and it's basically what it has come to be is a fellowship of congregational leaders who support one another in various ways. And finally, you have the International Messianic Jewish Alliance, which is just what it is. It's an international version of the American Messianic Jewish Alliance. There are Israelis in this group, there are Europeans in this group, there are Americans in this group, and they all get together somewhere to talk about issues to help the Messianic Jewish community thrive. All right. Finally, you have the Messianic Jewish Educational Institutions, which have cropped up over the years. You have the Messianic Jewish Theological Institute. These are just, most of these are, I think MJBI is sort of like Bible college. And Hashivenu is a think tank. It's not actually a school. It's just a think tank. It's a place where scholars gather and talk about the issues involved in this thing. We bore each other mostly. That's the thing. A lot of good stuff has come out of I can tell you what came out of Hashivenu was MJTI. The school actually came out of that group, and so did the Messianic Jewish Rabbinical Council. We came out of it. By the way, there's a lot of cross-fertilization here. The UMJC, Hashivenu is a UMJC group, Tikkun is a UMJC group, MJBI is an MJA group, a lot of cross-fertilization. Feinberg is a work of the Chosen People Ministries, a lot of cross-fertilization. But these are all schools. Joe Materko graduated from Feinberg. Hopefully Jared's going to graduate when he's finished. They're just schools, right? Okay, so this is so that's it for today. These are the this was just my effort at giving you an idea of the structure of the movement. Okay, there's a lot more to it, of course, but that's essentially what it is. Okay, any questions about what we discussed? I told you it was a whirlwind. We had to cover 1,500 years of time in an hour and a half. Not possible. Okay. All right. So any questions out there in television land?
Messianic congregations in Israel. I'll be there next month. I want to know where I can go and have Shabbat.
Where will you be? And
I'll be in Jerusalem.
In Jerusalem? Okay. So Charity Singer's mother is here. She read the Torah today. She lives in Jerusalem, and she goes to a congregation there. You should talk to her while she's there. And she can direct it. Netzer W. I think is that the name of Netzer? No.
Yeah.
Nativia. Nativia. The congregation in Jerusalem. But there are lots of others.
Charity's mom lives in Israel.
She lives in the Jerusalem area. Okay. Any other questions, guys, before I turn this thing off? No? We're all set? Okay, so next week, our next class, we're going to actually talk a little bit more about this whole idea of Messianic Judaism. Let me see what the next class is. Did I tell you? Did I put it in your booklet there? Can I see the book again?
Let's say hello.
Can I see that? I can do it this way. Hold on a second, guys.
The chosen people, the road less traveled.
That's
I got it.
sorry. So our next class is going to be the Messianic Jewish purpose and calling. Why did God raise this movement up now? So we're going to get very much more specific about why. Are we just another culturally driven church like Korean church or Hispanic community or something like that? Or is there something more to it?
No.
On the syllabus, you have Messianic Jewish Holocaust.
That's coming up.
Hmm?
That's coming up. But not next.
Okay.
Next week, we're going to talk about Messianic Jewish purpose and call. Okay?
Purpose and quality.
All right. So let's just have a word of prayer and then we'll dismiss. I can turn off.